My name is Liz, and I'm a member of the A-REALL Alpha cohort. I teach instrumental music in Prince George's County, Maryland, and I serve the Kettering Middle School community. For my artistic response, I've decided to venture into multimedia blended with some qualitative research methods and some narrative inquiry. My artistic capstone project will include some interviews with colleagues and friends who are involved in music, as well as some of my own thoughts about systemic barriers to music education, as well as how we can be more just in our field. Our first artistic response was a reflection, a way for us to kind of think about where we are, think about our field, and kind of get to know ourselves a little bit better as we move through this journey. For my artistic response, I reflected on three things: what I know, what I feel, and then, but what happens if? So, what I know that K-12 music education, the way it exists, disadvantages historically marginalized or historically forgotten communities. Many music educators and researchers have talked about this and the class divide at length. These educators and researchers include Elizabeth Gould, Vincent Bates, Ellen Brantlinger, and myself. What I feel that secondary music education can sometimes get bogged down improving our worth through performance. And sometimes that means that many music making opportunities or music engagement opportunities are often left out. There needs to be time for us to expand our curriculum so that we can take full advantage of music making and engagement that serves our communities. And lastly, what happens if we change the trajectory of K-12 music education? What does that mean for colleges and universities, conservatories, and large orchestras? Can we, K-12 music educators, change the landscape altogether? And what does that do for other enterprises that want to change? And should those enterprises want to change? These are all questions that have really big answers and far reaching consequences. And consequences isn't always a negative thing, sometimes those consequences can be positive. But what happens if we change K 12? Will our students be prepared to enter the conservatory or colleges and universities as they stand right now? Or does that mean that colleges and universities have to change and adjust with K 12? What does that mean for the orchestra? Artistic response number two um, allowed us to explore vocabulary. So I explored social justice as well as culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. Um, and in this activity, I reached out to some friends and colleagues who currently teach music, who are in charge of supervising music in our state, as well as friends who used to play an instrument but no longer play an instrument, and but they still have a passion for music, right? I also interviewed some colleagues and friends who are exploring culturally relevant and responsive pedagogy. I thought it was important to explore these two terms because sometimes these terms get thrown around a lot, and as we know, that words mean things. So if we are trying to become more socially just or culturally relevant, we need to really know what those things are. Applying social justice to music education requires investigating all levels of the field. That includes examining the practices of K 12 programs, music teacher training programs, advocacy groups, and even major orchestras and opera houses. We have to be willing to ask the question who is being served, who's being left out, who is being privileged or oppressed, and to what extent, and then also what barriers exist.
The role of social justice in music education is to take advantage of opportunities to bring awareness, particularly to students who have a limited perception of reality that is only based on their limited experiences for where they are in life.
Connecting students to a larger community and feeling like they deserve to be a part of it.
Your classroom is the center of it's the soul of your building. I think there is transformation that can occur when the arts room changes that spills out differently than if the math teacher takes this course and it's like, oh, now I see how to bring an racist lens. But the band teacher, the visual art teacher, there's a real opportunity to change the culture of a whole school. We have so much power as artists.
Art imitates life, and life is reflected through music. And music is something that is inherent to all people, and in all cultures. So if you choose to respect any and all cultures and the musical contributions that they have and treat them as equals, then you can also then teach it to your students saying, hey, these things here are all equal. They come from different places, yet they're all just as they're just as beautiful and just as important, and none is less than the other. And then teach them to then communicate that to all the other aspects of their lives.
Ultimately, I think the role of social justice and anti-racism work in education, regardless of the subject area, is liberation. Specifically, liberation from oppressive and harmful norms, practices, and structures. I think that we need to be attuned to issues around equity and injustice in the world at large, but also, how those things show up in our classroom environments and impact students directly every day.
So it's not just about reimagining our standards, but the music education system as a whole. Seeing how we can actually be inclusive in our curriculum.
I think it's important that music teachers not only just diversify their curriculums to make sure that there's much more inclusion of the other cultures and the other styles and the other understandings, but then also making sure that those same styles are put on the same light and the same pedestal.
What I would have loved and would have really appreciated is if the people who were in charge of those spaces, teachers, administrators, even families and parents who had influence over what was happening, could have seen how part of their role was making sure that that space would connect with the students who were involved in it. Part of that work, I think, is just making sure that people, like the young people involved in the program, know that they deserve to have a space there and that no one has the right to push them out or to make them feel like they're not welcome, and that they can trust the institution, whether that's the school band or the youth symphony or whatever it is, but that they can trust the institution to support them, and insofar as making them feel like they deserve to be there and no one can push them out.
I think first and foremost, educators should have their own internalized understanding of what social justice is and how it relates to their subject, and then develop their curriculum based on that.
Barriers to social justice in music education originate, in my opinion, with higher education. And there's two different parts to this that I see. From a performance aspect, future music teachers are put through detailed studies of pieces by Beethoven and Mozart and Bach and other white Western composers. And maybe if you're lucky, you'll get some diversity through someone like Philip Glass thrown in there kind of as an afterthought. But all this performance training is focused on classics, quote unquote, written by old white men, and it creates a never-ending stream of new music educators who only know one subset of world literature in detail. And it ends up being what they're comfortable with, and therefore it's what they want to teach. And the other issue is the future teachers are not taught to address trauma in students. And it's becoming clearer as time goes on that more children are living through adverse experiences, and teachers are often unaware of the effects these experiences have on kids' ability to learn. So for example, a child who's living in poverty may go home from school every night unsure of whether or not they will have dinner. and this is what their brain is focusing on after school, and it prohibits them from processing academic information, the same as a student who's not living in poverty. And poverty obviously isn't the only struggle. Some students experience violence in their neighborhoods or get caught in their parents' divorces, experience abuse, maybe living with mental health problems. It's a very long list of things that our students are dealing with, but colleges aren't teaching teachers or future teachers how to work with students to overcome these obstacles.
We are taught and then thereby teach, Western European theory and harmony. And our textbooks in college and, how we teach and what we're given to teach in terms of curriculum to our students is all based in, or unproportionately based in, Western European theory and harmony. And that's just one small lens of how we can perceive and experience music.
One of the first that comes to mind is the repertoire list that many states have as far as what music is allowed to be presented at festivals. Actually, the festival system is quite exclusionary to schools that may not be able to afford transportation or afford the ability to pay entrance fees for solo and ensemble festivals. The unfortunate thing is that we say we do these things in the name of promoting students and musical excellence, yet in fact, it creates barriers to seeing really your entire talent pool that may be present in a district or in a county within a state.
I think the biggest curricular/policy issue that I have that does disproportionately affect students of color is the idea that a concert band or wind ensemble is the be-all, end-all of instrumental music education. So much of what I have seen colleagues and supervisors focus on is getting kids ready for those county assessments or festivals where kids go on stage, they're all dressed the same, they have to play a march as their warm-up, they have to play 2 prepared pieces and then go off stage and sight read. And then people who have never talked to you as a teacher and don't know your students' situations or where they're coming from, tell them how well they played. And usually the process ends there. The issue with this is it's such a foreign and contrived environment. It's similar to how standardized tests often have reading passages about subjects that are completely irrelevant to students' life experiences, and then they get graded on comprehension questions about the same topic they've never heard about, and honestly, they don't care about it, so they don't do well. The same thing happens at festival. We put kids on stage in a concert band, and that's the first time they've ever seen a concert band as being a part of it. And they will never be in that concert band or festival situation outside of festival, so why are we treating it like the holy grail of performance assessment? And this concert band experience is also primarily geared toward students who have opportunities that are tied to economic stability. So students who thrive in concert bands are kids who can afford and have reliable transportation to private lessons. They don't have to babysit younger brothers and sisters after school every day. The successful band kids, the ones who tend to thrive the most in that traditional setting, are the ones whose parents can afford an $80 concert uniform and they have the ability to purchase it online. They have the ability to pay for private lessons. They can get their kids there every week. And a lot of the times, it's students of color who end up struggling to meet these material requirements. And we keep letting it impede their perceived progress. We as band directors have been taught year after year that our students' success as performers is somehow related to how they do at festival, almost exclusively, when the people who are adjudicating can't tell you how far your students have come since the beginning of the year because they don't know your kids and they don't know where they were starting.
Part of making significant change is addressing our teaching pedagogy. Culturally relevant and responsive teaching goes beyond forming relationships with our students. True implementation of CRT focuses on 3 domains: student achievement, cultural competency, and socio-political action. Through CRT, we empower students to take ownership of their learning, to ask the critical questions, and to become polycultural, or in our case, polymusical. If we don't change our pedagogy and develop cultural competency, we run the risk of continued passive engagement or putting on someone else's culture without regard for their cultural norms.
My biggest takeaway is that teachers aspire towards CRT, but they might not go all the way, and therefore are not completely successful. We've spoken about this before, where teachers make the effort to create relationships with their students, make changes to the curriculum, make connections to the community, but that last piece that's missing is the key to the signature of CRT. It's the social justice piece, having those nuanced and sometimes difficult conversations. We're going, but then we skirt the deeper issues, the meat of the issue. Some people say CRT is just good teaching. Well, yeah, you build good relationships with your students, yes. You differentiate instruction for their individual needs, yes. You build a connection to the community, yes, but you can do all of that without addressing the real issues behind their needs.
One of my biggest takeaways from this work that we've been doing on CRT is implementation and really spreading the word and how this is important with all education, but looking through the lens of with music, how we can be practical.
I think the biggest takeaways for me have been to always go back to that three-pronged approach that Ladson Billings talks about, because the way that CRT has been implemented, from the studies that I've read, from the theorists who keep trying to sort of move it forward, it usually ends up being a two-legged stool instead of three. Well, number one, you've got to get to know your students, so you can find out what cultures you are responding to, and I think the other piece of that is getting to know students on an individual basis and remembering that culture. One of the examples I remember reading is, that so many of us do nursing home concerts, but we never stop to have a conversation with the people in the nursing home. We rarely invite them to sing along with us, and we rarely ask them to teach us something about the music that they like. So just a sort of a practical way of looking at something we already do and changing or reframing it so that it is connected to the community, not just performing for people from the community. Mm-hmm. I think that's a big difference. As a white cis male, of a totally European background, the idea of bringing in culture bearers and finding ways to bring other people in to do instruction alongside of you, while modeling that you are a learner of other people's culture, and that is what we should all be doing as students is being learners, and that's so different than what I was taught, which was you go to the workshop on African drumming and then you're the expert on African drumming. And number one, there's no such thing as African drumming. Number two, you can never be the expert on it by going to a workshop. But you can be someone who is interested in a particular type of instrumental music from a particular country or a particular group of people who wants to bring that to your students to also learn about.
First, be real with your students so that they can be real with you. That takes you to the next level of trust needed for CRP or CRT. Second, the framework that we put together, there are actionable items on there, like considering repertoire, for instance, taking a critical look at what we're teaching, asking ourselves why we're teaching this or why we're not teaching something else.
One practice insight that I would like to share with colleagues, and it's a simple thing, and I think many people do, but is read books that are in fields that are new to you or unfamiliar, by authors that are unfamiliar, and go in with an open mind and perspective for new ideas and new ways of thinking, because I found that through reading, it's opened up my eyes so much into not just things regarding education and social justice, but thought patterns and systems that have been in place in a number of different realms. Another insight that I would love to share is, I guess I can break it down into two. One is the ability to have uncomfortable conversations, and then also the ability to allow you to pause, or have your students just pause and have that sometimes uncomfortable pause where no one knows what to say, but just let that sit and reflect.
The Los Angeles Youth Jazz Ensemble, or LAJ, is an ensemble sponsored by USC and Thornton School of Music's Thornton Community Engagement Program. I was the assistant director from fall 2012 to spring 2013. Auditions in this group were open to all high school students in Los Angeles County, but there were a few spots reserved for students who come from lower income communities. All students who participated in LAJ had access to private or small group instruction, playing performances at the House of Blues, working with renowned saxophonist Bob Mincer, and even recording an album in a studio in Burbank. There were a couple of students who started LAJ as freshmen, and they had only had a couple of years' experience on their instrument. Those students were from a neighboring high school where there wasn't a lot of money circulating in the community. But those students worked hard, and I could tell that every teacher in that school was really doing the best they could to make sure their students were successful. When I met those students from the neighborhood school, they were very shy, timid, and still getting a handle on their instrument. They don't start playing instruments until about sixth grade at that school. But they never gave up, and they always took full advantage of every opportunity afforded to them. And a few years later, I went back and I visited the high school band director. And I saw those students from LAJ. They were now seniors, and they were practically running the high school band program. They were providing leadership, modeling on their instruments, and just being the people who knew what was happening in the room, right? So that's to say that access to opportunity can change someone's life. The Eastside Music Project was spearheaded by my friend Dr. Isaac Lopez and the Los Angeles Music and Art School. The East Side of Los Angeles has a rich musical history that kept current to the popular trends in music over multiple generations. The concept of the East Side Project was to create a musical timeline that effectively told the story of the musical landscape by transcribing and arranging a series of medleys based on the repertoire of artists, bands, and musicians that called the East Side home. The project uses culturally responsive pedagogy as an avenue for students to explore this work, understand the cultural context in which the music was created, and instill a sense of pride in the musical ownership of their neighborhood, demonstrating that they hold the power to create meaningful art themselves. Dr. Lopez teamed up with members of the current bands. The students were able to interact directly with musicians whose art had an impact both locally and globally, further establishing a connection between the community music program and the neighborhood around it.
So LA Muse Art is it's a community-based nonprofit music and art school based in East LA, or actually technically it's in the east side of LA. Well, the idea was kind of brought to me by our grant writer and fundraiser chair, Kathleen Jacinto. The idea was to make about a 45-minute concert to essentially like document the history. Like when we finally nailed all the nuts and bolts down, it was like, let's do a historical chronology of the music from this area from about like the 1940s onward in terms of like popular music up to today. So I was like, okay, we could essentially like section off each song, about 6 or 7 songs. It ended up being 7 songs, to focus either on a singular artist that was really predominant, that really had a big like impact on a certain area or era or a certain time, or we would do a few artists that seemed to have like a certain like connection that would be able to fit together. There was one moment where I was having like some time with the tenor player in our ensemble, and he and I are pretty close. We've been working together for a few years, and he kind of was like, you know, when you brought this idea to us, like I was, you know, I wasn't he wasn't gonna say skeptical, but he was like okay, you know, we'll do it, you know, it'll be fine, it'll be cool. And he goes, you know, he's Mexican himself, and he was just like, yeah, I thought it was just gonna be like a what did he say? It was like an inclusion thing or like a diversity thing, because I think some of these kids have had experiences like that where they're given like that like, oh, this will be like the inclusion and diversity thing that we do, right? This is the one thing that we do for that. So and so I think he thought it was going to be something like that, and then he was like, when we started working on this, like he was like, I was not expecting it. I was not expecting to be turned on to artists and bands from this area that I kind of knew about but didn't really know, like, and didn't really know what the impact was, and didn't really know like how cool some of this stuff really is. And I was like, in my brain I was like, yes, it's working, it's happening. And I think for me, seeing that, it's like seeing these kids take ownership of their music, and like taking ownership, and I think seeing people like them be successful and playing dope stuff, like empower, you know, will empower anybody. If you see people like you playing dope stuff, like you're like, oh, I can do that, like, oh, I can do that, and now let's be the next generation to essentially like own it and make something. Advice I would give to other music teachers interested in embarking on something like this: you're gonna have to, like, I would say you're gonna need to do your research, do your listening, try not to just cherry pick. Try not. I mean, and when I say cherry pick, I mean cherry pick for yourself. Like what would be something that you would like to play, or what would be something that you 15, 20, 25 years ago, maybe more, when you were young, what would you want to play then, / what do you know now? Like, where can you get those two things to intersect, right? So, like, what, you know, I'm not going to tell like teachers how to teach. Y'all are more hip on it than I am, but definitely do the research on like who in your community like had these impact. I was fortunate enough in the East Side that there was like a bevy of really just like talented musicians and artists and individuals. And yeah, I think if you're interested in doing something like this, I guess really have a team kind of set together to be able to make it happen. Like, you know, if you need help with like transcribing or arranging, having somebody on your side who is you know, experienced with like writing grants to be able to help create like the financial backing for some of this would be, it wouldn't have been possible without that. I don't think. And I think the other thing is really reaching out to artists in your community. They don't have to be famous artists. They can be just artists in your community who want to, I think, connect, who I think want to embolden and empower the next generation of musicians. So then that way you can actually create like cross pollination between like your community and your ensemble, and something that's real and lasting, as opposed to something that might be, just to check off a box of fulfilling that like diversity and inclusion checklist or something, right? So yeah. I think there's real avenues to make lasting change with your community and your ensembles.
Artistic responses 3 and 4 were to do a systemic analysis of your arts discipline and then take an action plan that would enable you and your community, your spheres of influence, to make structural or systemic changes. For my systems analysis, I interrogated the performance assessment model for performance ensembles, particularly in 7th and 12th grades. More often than not, a group's successful outcome correlates to outside influences, or what you would call enrichment. So enrichment opportunities are never a bad thing, but often enrichment activities require excess funding, meaning that enrichment opportunities are tied directly to a family's disposable income, and that's problematic. Enrichment opportunities may be things like private lessons, guest directors or clinicians, higher quality instruments so that students sound better, uniforms so students look professional on stage, or even having a safe and quiet place to practice. Those items require disposable incomes, and families struggling with generational poverty may not have access to disposable income, nor is there extra money circulating the community. Federal economic policies such as redlining or subprime lending contributed to people of color not being able to purchase homes, or the undervaluation of property owned by people of color. Although redlining and subprime lending are illegal, these practices were upheld by banks and still implemented by banking institutions today. Also, the impact of these policies is being felt today. By not being able to own your own home or having your home undervalued, it translates into communities not having property taxes fully fund schools, or that there's a lack of money in the schools. Therefore, the school isn't able to provide educational opportunities that students deserve. And we, the people who work for the school system, wind up passing these costs on to families. So costs like renting an instrument or buying a uniform, providing textbooks, so the method books. Those are all things that are not typically provided by schools that we ask the parent or the community to pay for. These economic policies were established because of white supremacy in our country and the desire to prevent races from even living in the same neighborhoods. By continuing to rely on large ensemble or small ensemble performance assessments to assess learning or to assign value to a school's music program, we are doing a disservice to students while still maintaining the status quo. One could argue that music lists and rubrics exist to bring reliability and validity to the assessment itself, but I counter that the path to assessment is not equal, and therefore we really have to reevaluate the system in and of itself. One way we can address the inequity is expanding the curriculum taught in performance-based classes. This means we would need to change or adjust teacher training programs, the credentials necessary for teaching certification, while providing ongoing and meaningful professional development to in-service teachers. We have to reimagine formal music education and expand curricula so that we can meet the needs of students in the communities that we serve. This is a big job, and music educators at all levels should participate and be accountable to the changes. Larger structural changes like teacher certification and undergrad curriculum may take a few years, but in-service teachers can make changes now to their programs. Supervisors and advocacy groups can offer professional development in real time that support teachers who are making decisions in the best interests of the communities that they serve. For artistic response, number 5, I researched Nikki Giovanni and James Baldwin and the Black Arts Movement. I rediscovered a conversation between Nikki Giovanni and James Baldwin from the late 60s. The conversation was profound and deeply poignant. A portion of the conversation that stuck with me was about relationships and faking love. In the conversation, James says, "If I love you, I can't lie to you." Nikki explains, "Of course you can and you will. What the hell do I care about the truth? I care that you're there." She further asks, "What does the truth matter? How are you going to be truthful with me when you lie to everyone else? Because I love you, I get the least of you, so fake it with me." The clip resonates with me because there are plenty of conversations about diversity, equity, inclusion, access, justice, culturally relevant, and responsive teaching. But I feel like the conversation prolongs action. And as Nikki Giovanni puts it, that's faking love. Personally, I'm past the point of wanting someone or an institution to fake being in love with me. Either you're in love with me or you're not. Either you're going to do the real work of DEIA or you're not. Either way, tell me the truth. So my artistic response was a graphic design called Fractured Reflection. The parallels between Nikki Giovanni's plea for James Baldwin to fake being in love with her and the ongoing conversations of DEIA without pedagogical and systemic change is staggering. Without support, power, and agency given to teachers to make change, we only reflect a broken system. And then our students reflect the broken system. So where do we go from here? I want to encourage everyone from teachers, administrators, professors, leaders, whoever, to do a systems analysis on their own arts discipline. Interrogate the status quo and best practices and ask, why is this the status quo and why are these best practices? Investigate institutions that support the status quo. Then challenge the institution to change. Ask yourself, are my students being unintentionally harmed by policies or practices? Reflect on your places of privilege, then set aside your privilege to amplify marginalized voices in the room. Decenter yourself. Lastly, roll up your sleeves and do the work. Take full advantage of the resources being offered and then apply what you've learned.